And my first day of training, you guys, was the day of the Oklahoma City bombing. And I'm sitting there in class, and they came and told us what happened, and we all ran upstairs to our hotel rooms and watched it on the news. And then I went back to class, and I'm like, well, okay, let's do this, because, you know, if this kind of stuff is going on, we gotta be ready. And I kid you not, 2 weeks later, I'm sitting across from an Oklahoma City firefighter, and he was telling me about how he went into what was left of the Murrah building, and he found what was left of the daycare. I followed him through his whole career. He retired as a battalion chief 3 years ago with zero problems. So this technique is awesome. I always say that if you are a therapist and you're going to do this on first responders, you need to get the first responder protocol down, because a lot of the EMDR trainings now are kind of geared towards, oh, you know, I'm a soccer mom and I saw a bad wreck about a month ago and it really upset me. And, you know, you guys, you're like, what? And so your trauma is way worse. And when we open Pandora's box, it all comes out. You guys are exposed to the worst of people and the worst days of their lives. It's a hit after a hit after a hit. And with the psychic battering, it's just the continuous just hit. And then you throw on shift work and lack of sleep and changing shifts and rotating shifts. And you're on night shift, but now you're going to the 40-hour CIT class, so you're on days, and then you're back to nights. And then, you know, your family is like, you know, is complaining because of your shift work or because of your job. It's this continuous, it's just hitting after hitting after hitting to the brain. And it just wears first responders down. There's so many challenges.
You're listening to the ATO Bridging the Divide podcast, brought to you by the Assist the Officer Foundation. Since 1999, the ATO has given assistance to the first responder community, and now we want to give a platform to hear their incredible stories. We also want to hear the stories of the many people that support us. Our community is small, but it is strong. We have differences. We don't always agree, and we all make mistakes. But together we can grow, we can heal, and we can learn from those mistakes. And together we can bridge the divide. Welcome back to the Bridging the Divide podcast. Pain is inevitable and suffering is optional. First responders are always trying to seek out and improve themselves, whether it's higher education, the newest tactical firearm training, learning the newest trends in drug interdiction. But there's one area I believe we need to continually improve on, and I really don't think we do a good job of, is mental health and wellness. As we all try to seek out new and better ways to improve and be a better version of us, our guest today strives to helping veterans and first responders with 30 years of experience. She deployed to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. In 2001, she deployed to New York City. She was in New Orleans for Katrina, and to Dallas in the aftermath of July 2016 attack. She is recognized nationally, noted author with numerous books dealing with mental health, PTSD, with military and first responders. It is my great honor to welcome on Dr. Tania Glenn. Dr. Glenn, you have the stage.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for an awesome introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I really, any chance to spread the word about caring for first responders is a huge gift for me.
Thank you so much. It took me a week to get that intro prepared. I'm just kidding. It's well deserved. Your bio and your resume it's 10 miles long, and it's impressive, and I can't thank you enough for all the assistance you've given all of us over the years and what you're going to continue to do. I just can't thank you enough for that. Doctor, in your many years of seeing first responders and veterans and suffering through PTSD, have you seen a shift in people seeking out help?
I have, I'll tell you, when I first started my career, I likened it to pushing a boulder up a hill. And most recently, in the past, 5 to 10 years, we've seen the shift. And I think that enough first responders have come forward, enough first responders have been notably hurting, and enough first responders have met their demise. And I think that ultimately, the result of all the pain and suffering of so many people has finally caught wind and made it okay to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, to talk about treatment, to talk about prevention, and to get our leaders engaged in finally providing good resources and programs to help them. So it has shifted, and I love it because finally it's now on the forefront. While it is now on the forefront, there is a little bit of misinformation going on, but at least we're having the discussion and the dialogue, and people are much more open to committing the resources necessary to put together good programs for their folks.
Yeah, with the Dallas PD and the Sissy Officer Foundation, we have a mental health program that we offer mental health therapy confidentially, and we have seen a big uptick really since the July 7th shootings, and it's a good thing. People are now kind of trying to break the stigma and coming out and get more involved and getting help and recognizing they actually need help. Reading through your bio, there was an incident in 1993 in Waco, Texas. How did that event shape you and your mission and to be who you are today?
I went home and I watched that go down on the news, and like a lot of people, I was completely horrified, and I couldn't stand it. I was 3 months away from finishing my master's degree at the University of Texas, and I knew that day, I knew I wanted to work with trauma and in crisis intervention, but I just didn't know like the exact sort of focus, and that did it for me. That day I decided I was on board. I wanted to go to Waco. I wanted to help people like the ATF. Of course I couldn't because I hadn't even finished grad school yet. And I told my professors I was going to do that. They told me I was crazy. So here I am 30 years later, just as crazy as the rest of you. And I love it. Well, to go to Waco, I did end up with a widow in my practice. And so that's how I was able to give back to that event. I did have an ATF widow in my practice. And so that was several years later, but that's how I was able to give back to that. But it's amazing how you have this one defining moment and it changes everything. And I just knew that this was my thing.
Well, it helped you find your why, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I was working at a level 2 trauma center in Austin, and I just started to ride with police, fire, EMS. I worked weekend nights. I had a side job on the side because when you get out of grad school, you have big student loans, and I was building my tiny little practice on the side as well. And so I would switch my schedule to weekdays during the week so I could do my other stuff, and then I'd have to flip back over to weekend nights for my job at the hospital. And so on Thursday night, to be up all night so I could sleep on Friday, I would just go ride. And I rode, just thousands of hours, law enforcement, fire, EMS, and just got really sort of into the culture and the terminology. And that is one of the best things I've ever done. I do write about that in my books a lot. I kind of get after therapists who think that they can see first responders while they've never set foot into a patrol car or into a fire station. You've got to know that stuff.
Dr. Glenn, it seems like you've done your homework. I've read your book. I read it this weekend. And you've spent a lot of time with first responders, and they have difficult personalities. Do you feel like there's pieces of your personality that are similar, that fit in, that can relate?
Yes, 100%. Actually, when I was, I think it was like halfway through grad school, and one of my teachers, my professors was saying, hey, Tania, you're too type A to be a therapist. And I was like, well, crap. I'm only I'm halfway through this. And she's like, you need to just bring it back a notch and not be so determined. And I was like, And so I remember that. And what I ended up doing is finding my perfect patient population. I am a type A and so are you. I'm very straightforward. I'm very direct. I have thick skin, and I love to help people who want to be helped. And I like to get people through their pain as quickly as possible. And that's the first responder community. I think that my patients, their mantra is, fix yesterday. Well, I'm the woman to do that. Let me jump in and help you. And I think that's always been one of the biggest assets of my career, is the personality that I bring. I get it from my mother. My mother was she's German, and she lived in Berlin in World War II. And so she's totally badass, and she created my resilience, and I think she really built like the woman that I am. Looking back, I see it now. At the time, it was just, she was pretty hardcore as a mom, but now I look back and I'm just so grateful for everything she did to install this resilience in me to be able to do what I do.
Doc, I had a question for you. Well, I had a privilege listening to you speak at the resiliency little conference we had in Richardson, Texas. I think it was hosted by the Richardson Fire Department back in 2019, November. Hey, at the beginning of this, you mentioned something. We're talking about people seeking some type of help. You said there's a lot of some of the misinformation out there. What misinformation are you referring to as far as when it comes to people getting treatment and so on and so forth?
No, I think the biggest thing is the biggest thing I see now is, when people talk about like the suicide epidemic and public safety, they're making everything about trauma. And while there is a lot of trauma, I think what happens when you make everything about trauma in terms of the suicide epidemic, we're overlooking things like poor sleep patterns, poor sleep hygiene, all the resilience building things that need to happen. I think that there's huge deficits in our annual physicals for our first responders. You guys, with all of your fight or flight responses, your cortisol is doing all kinds of things to you. Your hormones are out of whack. And I think that when PTSD became sort of the hot topic subject, everything kind of became about PTSD. But really, truly, where we need to start is with, your healthy brain and your healthy body, and really making sure that we're focusing on the whole picture and not just trauma. My beef with social media is they make the suicide epidemic about trauma. And again, while there is a lot of it, I think that we also have to look at, when people aren't sleeping and when their chemistry is off, their hormones are off, your brain does some really wacky stuff to you, like tell you to kill yourself. And so we have to look at the big picture and not just make it about trauma.
No, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because as you know, there's more to it than just sitting down and having somebody say, hey, I'm suicidal. When you first go in for some type of panel, they're probably going to take a blood panel of you to make sure your vitamins are up to par, your hormones are at certain levels, you're not deficient in something else, and it goes more in depth than that. And that's why you and a few other doctors that I know of that I really enjoy hearing talk and teach, because there's more to it than just, hey, I'm feeling suicidal, or maybe I have a problem. But your problem could be the residual of a larger problem that people have overlooked, including your own personal physician, that you just have no clue that, especially the having some form of sleep problem and what that does to a body. And I don't think most people know, especially those that work a deep night schedule, right? Those that work on a deep night shift, they work that for years, but they are deprived of so many different things that it causes them all kinds of mental fog and whatnot. I mean, some people, I'm sure they deal just fine with it, but I mean, that's good. And I'm glad that you mentioned that.
When you think about, like if we take someone to the ER and they appear like psychotic, well, we're going to do lots of blood draws to see if they've taken something, right? Before we call it like psychosis or a psychotic break, like a mental health disorder, we're going to see if there's a physical reason. And I think a lot of therapists forget that. That's actually a question on a licensing exam. In order to rule in any in order to rule in any mental health maladies, you have to rule out all physical ones. And a great example is I had a police officer who felt like he was having anxiety attacks, is what he called it. And he said, I don't understand. I love my job. I love my life. I love my family. And so while I was scheduling him, I asked him to go to see a physician. And it turns out he was low vitamin D, low cortisol, low testosterone, and hyperthyroid. And all of those combined, first thing the physician said, all of those combined will manifest as anxiety. So he didn't need me, right? Because he needed to get all that fixed. And so that's a really important piece, is that we look at everything. And it's there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to the human body that we need to consider as we go through, healing our warriors.
Yeah, that's a good point. You have to look at everything because everybody's different. Their chemistry and makeup and how each individual is affected by any, whether it's a critical incident or just the day-to-day wear and tear of this job or the task that we do. Doctor, now have you changed your approach with with responding to all these nationwide critical incidents over the years? Everything's ever changing. How have you changed and evolved as with all these different experiences you've had?
I think the biggest thing is I've learned to really start where the first responders are. In Oklahoma City, there was such this push for the critical incident stress debriefings. And, people need time and space. And the way I teach people now is to start with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is it's like a pyramid. And at the base of the hierarchy of needs is food, water, clothing, shelter, and safety. And we start there, and we start to heal hearts and minds through our actions of providing water and changing gloves and pulling splinters out of fingers, because that's what people need initially. And then as people move up the hierarchy of needs and there's the more psychological needs that start to happen, that's when we really get in. And as soon as people feel like, okay, I'm ready to address my psychological needs, the focus now in my world with my practice is prevention, prevention, prevention. So as soon as someone's ready to address the psychological cognitive stuff, we get in and we mitigate it as quickly as possible. So we start where people are, we bring them to safety and as much health as we can. And then when people are ready to talk about whatever it is that's happened or to address the trauma, I really like to get in very quickly and do prevention. We work hand in hand with peer support teams across the country. And I absolutely adore our peer support teams. I consider them an extension of my practice. And the peer support teams are so good at identifying when someone's really ready to deal with something. But that prevention and that mitigation is the key, in my opinion. We don't sit around and wait to see if someone's going to get post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's go ahead and address that and mitigate it.
Well, speaking on your peer support programs, you have quite the reputation for going to agencies and actually setting up these programs. What is your process and your recipe for success on these? Because I've had quite a few people reach out to me when they heard we were going to have you on, and they wanted me to ask you about this.
Yeah, awesome. I'll talk about peer support all day, every day. So here's kind of where I started. In Oklahoma City, we were doing the CISDs, and the police department told us very quickly that those were not going to work. They were like, do not put cops in a circle. Do not make us talk about things. And I'm like, yep, I see it. And so I kind of floated around the country, and I was in Tucson, and I was working with the Border Patrol in the aftermath of the Brian Terry murder. And so Brian Terry was one of their BORTAC agents. He was one of their snipers. And if you look that up, you'll find a whole host of information about Brian Terry. So I'm working with their SOG, and I'm riding along, getting rapport going and getting to know the guys. They were very traumatized. It was a very difficult time for them. And one day we're riding out, and we're outside of Tucson, and we stopped to fuel up, and I ran into a Border Patrol agent who was also refueling, and he told me that he's on the peer support team. And he said to me, he's like, hey, when are you going to come spend time with us? And I said, well, invite me. And so they did. They invited me to a peer support class in Yuma in August. It was awesome. It was like living in an oven. And so I got to see their model. And I at that point, I knew this is a great model, and it works very, very well. It was born out of desperation. They had multiple suicides in 2008. That was the birth of their peer support team. So what I did is I took the best of the Border Patrol peer support team training, and I kind of molded it to be more sort of fire EMS and PD friendly. And so what I do, it's a 3-day training. Before we ever get to the training, though, I wrote a book. It's called I've Got Your Six, and it has sample policies, a sample application. It has sort of an overview of the kind of team members that I'm looking for. And it has basically everything that you need to just set it up initially. And then we train, and I train real hard. I teach people, we educate the team members on how to educate and normalize people's reactions. I teach them how to listen. I teach them how to not fix. I teach people how to not interrupt. And so a lot of times they go home and their spouses are like, why are you listening to me and not interrupting? And so it usually starts a conversation. And so, and by the end, what I tell the team members is that you have the tools now to go do this. You will always be nervous. You should always be nervous, because the day you decide that you've arrived, you should not be doing peer support. And we really get into all the skill building that they need. Day 3 also covers group interventions that do work, which doesn't include sitting in a circle. And then I explain how to do those. And that's a model that I developed that's in my first book.
That's amazing, Dr. Glenn. I feel like a lot of this comes after the math, after there's already some issues going on. If we sent you out to our police academy and say you had 10 minutes, can you give me a quick checklist that you could give recruits, a way to keep their mental health in check, of things that they can do?
Yeah.
Because we talked about sleep, but what are some of your other things?
Oh, yeah. So if I had 10 minutes, and so if you're giving me 10 minutes, right? So if I had 10 minutes to talk to your recruits, I would tell them that after bad calls, it's normal to replay those calls pretty hardcore for the first few days. But by 7 days post-incident, we want that call as though it's starting to fade and bank in your long-term memory. And by 14 days post-incident, we want that banked in your long-term memory. If at 14 days it is not banked in your long-term memory and you're still replaying it, you smell it, and you can taste it, and you're nightmaring about it, to get help. And then I would flip over and talk about resilience. And I would encourage them to start small: hydration, nutrition, rest, and exercise. And then we go into your family, your faith, your friends, and your hobbies, your life outside the job. So if I had 10 minutes, those are the 2 most important things that I'd say in my brief, which is actually 2 hours. I say, these are the most important things I want you to remember. It's the 1 week mark and 2 week mark after a nasty call. And it's the resilience building through your life and having a life outside the job. Because at the end of it all, you know what happens when you hang it all up, you have your life outside the job.
Yeah, that's important, because I don't think a lot of first responders, they can't see themselves past this job. And that's something that I think all of us need to prepare for, including myself. Doctor, can you tell the listener what firepower resiliency is? I know you're big on that. I want you to explain it for the listener, please.
So firepower resilience, it's a brand new presentation I put together. We're putting a brand new documentary together on firepower resilience. So the definition of firepower is the capacity to deliver effective fire on a target. And so my belief is that firepower resilience means getting it right and restoring the health and the well-being of all of our first responders in a timely manner. So hitting the target and making sure it's right. So the upcoming documentary, which will be out in December, it's going to highlight 4 first responders who had absolutely awful, horrible events happen to them, and how, with the combination of peer support and my team, we were able to get in very quickly and basically mitigate their traumas. So we're talking, one person had EMDR on day 4 post-incident. One person had EMDR while he was still at Bentop Hospital. I stood over his hospital bed and did EMDR. And so I'm talking about, this is kind of like resilience on steroids, but I didn't want to call it, resilience on steroids. So I thought firepower resilience, because it's effective fire on a target. Let's hit it right. Let's hit the bullseye, and let's do the very best we can, instead of hey, you okay? Yeah, I'm good. And okay, well, let me know if that changes, because that's simply not enough, right? So this documentary is going to introduce the concept of firepower resilience and how quickly we get in to mitigate and prevent some of the really nasty stuff that could potentially happen down the line.
Yeah, you kind of hit on it. I was going to talk about the mitigating and preventing the possibility of PTSD, because getting in before the incident is what you're about. You want them to set basically a template for themselves, right? to grow from initially?
So at our practice, we really focus on number one, customer service. Number two is the education. It's like that pre-incident inoculation. Hey, these are normal responses to stress, and here's what you do about it. And then number three, the trust in us to come in very quickly to work through whatever it is that's happened, so we can mitigate that. And that's a win all around.
Dr. Glenn, you mentioned EMDR. We have a lot of our listeners that have no idea what you're talking about. Will you explain it to us and then give us an example of somebody that it's helped?
Absolutely. So EMDR, thank you for asking, is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And honestly, in my opinion, it's the biggest tool we have in our toolbox. And what it does, it's a technique that we actually replicate rapid eye movement, which is when you process trauma from the last 48 hours, but you're awake and alert and in control. It's not hypnosis. We don't put you under a spell. And what it does is, by replicating the rapid eye movement, is it gets your brain to move the trauma that's stored in the frontal lobe, which is why you're replaying it. And we get your brain to open the synapses in the frontal lobe and process and download and move those images into your long-term memory. So what happens with the call is it goes from like sitting in your face and replaying all the time to becoming this fading distant memory. And then we notice the triggers go away and the nightmares go away and people get on with their lives. So an example I'll give you. So my first day of training, I actually flew to Baltimore to take this class. And at the time, I wasn't even a believer 100%. I was really skeptical. And my first day of training, you guys, was the day of the Oklahoma City bombing. And I'm sitting there in class and they came and told us what happened. And we all ran upstairs to our hotel rooms and watched on the news. And then I went back to class and I'm like, well, okay, let's do this, because, if this kind of stuff is going on, we gotta be ready. And I kid you not, 2 weeks later, I'm sitting across from an Oklahoma City firefighter, and because we deployed up there, and he was telling me about how he went into what was left of the Murrah building and he found what was left of the daycare. So he was the first person I did EMDR on. And that at the time was firepower resilience. And I watched this transformation. He had really good fading. Because he was my first patient ever to do EMDR on, I followed him through his whole career. He retired as a battalion chief 3 years ago with zero problems. So this technique is awesome. I always say that if you are a therapist and you're going to do this on first responders, you need to get the first responder protocol down, because a lot of the EMDR trainings now are kind of geared towards, I'm a soccer mom and I saw a bad wreck about a month ago and it really upset me. And, you guys, you're like, what? And so your trauma is way worse. And when we open Pandora's box, it all comes out. And so we have a very different protocol for first responders. And so I always encourage therapists to get more training to do this on first responders, because once we open your floodgates, we gotta be able to contain it. So the process is amazing. I love doing it. I have people who come in from across the country. We do 2-day intensives. So we'll have a police officer or firefighter who will come in. We hit it all on day one. We spend pretty much the better part of a day with them. And then on day 2, we do the follow-up. And really, this cleans up about 95% of it. It's all the heavy lifting is done. And then I can pass them off to a therapist back home who maybe doesn't do EMDR or isn't as savvy with the public safety population. And it's just absolutely phenomenal.
That's amazing. And we're talking about first responders. What if a first responder hasn't been in a traumatic incident but is carrying trauma from childhood, say sexual abuse or physical abuse? Is that something that would be effective as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was actually one of the first studies I engaged in as an EMDR trained therapist. It was childhood sexual abuse. And I was in the group that the patients got the EMDR versus the control group that didn't. And the group that got it was way, way, way better. So frequently we do have, I've noticed a really high rate of pretty gnarly child abuse for a lot of our first responders. And so when they come in, a lot of times they don't even realize why certain calls bother them or get under their skin so much until we get into, their childhood. Now, it's not really our style to be like, well, tell me about your mother and tell me about your father, because most therapists, they want, all of that. And we always start with wherever the first responder is. But if they want to go to childhood, we can and we do. And it is intensely effective for that.
I've actually went through some sessions of EMDR therapy, and it did. I had an effect, especially with the dreams. And an earlier episode, Chris Webb, he had so many good things to say about you, and also EMDR, and it unlocked a portion of his brain, and he didn't really realize it until he went to sleep, and he started having these really weird, vivid dreams. And I experienced the same thing. It's a powerful experience.
I had a quick question for you. I think because I think the individuals are going to listen. I think some will associate themselves in some form or fashion, and others will refuse. Right? They just refuse to believe that there's anything wrong with them. And it doesn't mean everybody has to have something wrong with them, but when we look at the mind, I think one thing that a lot of people deal with, and it's just probably age, an age perspective, what would be like a mental fog and so on and so forth. Can you, not necessarily PTSD, but just a generalized broad spectra of the first responder trauma that you have seen, can you give like certain ailments that people may recognize or notice, and so when they hear that, they're like, hey, maybe I can associate with something? Or is there any particular list? I know there's a gamut of them, but I don't even know if that's a fair question. Can you answer that, or is that not fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, the biggest thing, the most obvious one is usually when your family members talk about how you've changed and it's not necessarily for the better. That's a big one, is, your significant other or spouse really kind of picks up on your energy, and they'll indicate like, hey, that something's really different, like your sense of humor, your energy. I think the biggest thing we see with our first responders is they just feel so tired all the time. And of course that may be fatigue from the job, but, trauma takes a lot out of you too. And living, with certain things just bothering you or triggering you. I think that the biggest thing to notice is that you've changed in your outlook, your perspective, how you view society and people. I think so often you guys deal with just the really negative side of society, and you miss out on the good side, and you no longer see the good people who love you. And I think that over time, what you notice is that you have less energy, you're more irritable, you feel like you're sweaty all the time, you don't feel good, you don't have quite the zest or the the stuff that you used to. And then, the family members pointing out things as well. And it doesn't mean you have PTSD. It might mean you have burnout. It might mean you just have some unresolved calls that you just need to process that aren't necessarily PTSD. But I think that the biggest thing is to notice that, like, we just feel different. And when you're using coping mechanisms that maybe aren't so good, if you're drinking too much, if you're, engaging in risky behaviors, or, what I call survivor high, which is kind of, pushing the limits on things. These are all things that you may not see, but your loved ones will see. It's important to just pay attention to those things.
Dr. Glenn, in your book, you say it is imperative that first responders receive help when going through psychic battering. Can you tell our listeners what psychic battering is, and give me like an example, like some kind of self-talk that we hear in our brains?
Yeah, so psychic battering is the continual pounding of people's worst days. I always say, and when I give my trauma and resilience class, that no one calls 911 because today's a good day. You guys see pain and despair and sorrow and death and violence and chaos and destruction, and you see horrible things happening to children and innocent people, and you guys are exposed to the worst of people and the worst days of their lives. And so it's like it's a hit after a hit after a hit, and it's so easy to forget that there's happy, healthy people who abide by the laws and pay their taxes and really appreciate you. And with the psychic battering, it's just the continuous just hit. And then you throw on shift work and lack of sleep and changing shifts and rotating shifts, and you're on night shift, but now you're going to the 40-hour CIT class. So you're on days, and then you're back to nights. And then, your family is like, is complaining because of your shift work or because of your job. It's this continuous, it's just hitting after hitting after hitting to the brain. And it just wears first responders down. There's so many challenges. Of course, now, since COVID kicked off, it's psychic battering just amplified. And so these are all the many things that our folks need to just have an opportunity just to kind of refuel that internal fuel tank so they can nurture their souls. And that's what psychic battering is.
Doc, in your book, First Responder Resilience, Caring for Public Servants, you say the first session is critical. Why do you believe that, and how do you handle that?
So almost every patient that calls us or emails us, they have picked up the phone 100 times, or they've started that email 1,000 times. And when they finally hit send, it is nerve-wracking. It is very hard to sit in someone's waiting room knowing that you're asking for help. And if you've never been to therapy, you have no idea what to expect. And you feel like, you're worried the therapist can read your mind, which we can't. And you're worried that, we're going to have a horrible gut-wrenching discussion and, all that stuff. And so everybody comes in with these preconceptions about what it is that's about to happen. They're nervous. I mean, it's, I've done it sitting in a waiting room about to talk about your crap, and it's pretty scary. And so that first session, we work really hard to call our people back right away. And if we don't get an answer, we leave a message, we send them a text. We work very diligently to get people in within 3 days of their first call. And so that way there's kind of that no waiting around with the actual first session. If I don't have a client before that new person, I'll get them in quickly. And, we honestly, we're waiting for them to come. We have everything ready. We get them back as quickly as possible. I try as hard as I can when I have a first time client to not schedule someone right before them, because if there's ever a time to decide, maybe I don't need to do this, it's when you're sitting in the waiting room waiting. And so we typically try to not schedule someone the session before a new patient. And then as soon as they walk in the door, they're straight back. And so that way we don't scare anybody or make them sit in the waiting room for too long and decide not to do this. Our office is very, it's not like a typical therapy office. We have all kinds of cool stuff on the walls. At our practice, we also have an extra door, a side door. And so that door is for our law enforcement officers who are involved in high publicity critical incidents. Because, if you're involved in a shooting or you're involved in something that the media is all over, you don't want to be seen. And so we give them a code to that door and they come in the side entrance and just wait for us there. So that's the kinds of stuff that we do to increase the likelihood that people will really just come in and feel comfortable. They have to feel comfortable. And in that first session, we try to develop as quickly as possible what I call a plan of attack, which is technically a treatment plan, but we call it the plan of attack. And so they know that they're on a path to healing and that there's steps to get there. And we're not just going to be like, oh, welcome to therapy, and we're going to spend 18 months talking about one thing. We're on a mission. And so I really try to develop a plan very quickly and give people a sense of how long I think it'll take, give or take. And so people have a sense of where we're going.
Dr. Glenn, how do we recognize progressive desensitization? How do we recognize that?
So what that actually is, progressive desensitization is something that we do after EMDR. And so, for example, like if you're involved in a shooting and it's a horrible shooting, and we would EMDR the shooting, and then we would take you out to the range. Or, for example, when someone's involved in a really nasty wreck in the middle of an intersection, we do EMDR and then we go drive through the intersection. Or a flight nurse who's involved in an incident, we do EMDR and get on a helicopter and go fly. So that's actually what that is. And so what we're doing is we're mitigating all the stress and anxiety about being back in the place or the moment that caused the trauma. And that's what that is. So I call EMDR plus progressive desensitization, I call them the 1-2 punch.
Can you tell us about somebody that specifically has helped? Can you give us a story so others can relate?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So one of my well-known progressive desensitizations, because I use it in my training, was a flight nurse for an air medical company. They hit the side of a cell phone tower and it tore off the left skid. And they ended up having to land on a stack of firefighters' mattresses at the San Antonio airport. And she was way freaked out. I mean, she was beside herself, and she was not good. And she took 7 shifts off, and I knew she was going to quit her job. And so during her 7 shifts off, which, in a 24/48 world is about a month, I was working with her and I told her, we're going to do EMDR. And I told her, I said, we're going to do EMDR at the base. The company put the aircraft out of service. And the only other person at the base at the time was the pilot, just kind of waiting on us to be done. And I told her, I was like, bring your flight suit, because after EMDR, we're going to go fly. And she's like, that's insane. I cannot, no, you're going to wave your fingers in front of my face for a couple of hours and then I'm going to want to go fly. And I said, yes. She's like, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And so sure enough, she showed up, she brought her flight suit, we did EMDR. And as soon as we were done, she's like, well, let's go fly. So we went up in the air. The pilot took us around. He's like, let's go look for new towers and wires, because this area is growing so rapidly. And we went field, so we got a landing in and we took off again and we headed back to the base. And the pilot's like, I'm just going to fly a few approaches if you don't mind. And I'm like, totally fine. We're in the back, we're high-fiving, taking selfies. And she told me mid-flight, she's like, I was going to quit my job. And I said, I know. And actually, she just retired from the company. So that's one where, I just love doing that. Love doing that. Just get back to the thing that caused the trauma and overcome it. Let's not have you go out to where it happened. And the first time you go out there, you're on a call. I want it to be off duty so we can just work through it and breathe and focus and get your skills back and get your confidence back.
Awesome.
That's awesome. It's just helping one person, and you've helped God knows how many. There's probably people you've helped that have sit through your seminars and read your books. You don't even know. It's so impressive, and I can't tell you how excited some of our ATL therapists were. They're excited. They can't wait to hear your episode once we air it. And they've actually sent me some questions for you, and they've sat through your seminars. And Melissa McLemore, giving her a shout out. She owns all of your books, and yeah, I think she's got a crush on you, but it's okay.
That is so sweet. Thank you. I am thrilled that other therapists are finding that useful.
Yeah, very useful. I want to get your thoughts on moral injury. I just recently watched a video that you put out, and former DPD SWAT operator Chris Webb, he dealt with a death of an infant hostage, and he spoke on that. Can you explain to the listener what moral injury is?
Absolutely. So the moral injury is when something happens and you cannot get there fast enough. You can't change the outcome. It's the sort of the responsibility that you take on when things go wrong. So the biggest moral injury, the term came from, of course, the military. So, for example, when insurgents used women and children as human shields, no value for women and children, obviously, in that situation. But our armed services, of course, have high value for saving women and children. And when you put an AK in their hands and you tell them to point that AK at the Marines, the options are pretty much just one. And so the moral injury is, I had to take these actions that the outcome wasn't what I wanted. That's not consistent with my morals. And so what happens with a moral injury is you feel it, you take it on, you're ashamed, you're embarrassed, you're horrified, you're angry, you're hurt, you feel betrayed. And it actually, a lot of people are diagnosing moral injuries as PTSD, but you have to be very clear in differentiating. With a moral injury, you won't have the intense living and the flashbacks, but you will have all of the emotional distress. And so when first responders are going through academies and going through training, you're of course trained to change an outcome or create an outcome that's positive. This is how we save lives. This is how we intervene. And when you can't get there, what happens is it logs this feeling of helplessness. And I will tell you, helplessness is the number one emotion that gets processed in EMDR in our office. And helplessness is very foreign to you all because you all are trained to be in control and maintain control and stay in control. You're in charge. It's your scene. And when you can't get control, it feels very, very horrible. And so the moral injury is that I could not get there fast enough, and I could not change this outcome. But before help, what happens, unfortunately, in the mind of a first responder who's got a moral injury is the self-talk is not so much I couldn't get there fast enough. It's I failed, or I sucked, or I'm horrible at my job, or I'm a horrible human being. That's what the brain does. The brain and any sort of mental health problem, it always goes to bad. And so the self-talk of first responders with moral injuries is really, really awful. And when we do the EMDR, what we get people to see is that, it's not that you didn't do your job, it's that the outcome was already pretty much done by the time the numbers 911 were hit on the first phone, And so it's the ability to put that into perspective is huge for our first responders.
Doc, when you talk about educate, normalize, what does that mean to you?
So I love doing the brief that we do, the trauma and resilience brief. I start with fight or flight. I joke that the F word is feelings. We don't use that word. We use the other one quite a bit, but not feel.
Yeah.
And we also use fight or flight quite a bit, right? So I start fight or flight is the foundation. And we describe the chemistry of the stress response and what happens to the brain and the body. And then I weave fight or flight through the 4 types of stress. So acute, delayed, cumulative, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I make it about the science of stress and physiology. And this is the language of first responders. And the whole time, as I'm pointing out all of the awful, things that happen in, an acute stress response, I'm normalizing all of it. And I think when people hear that, they start to realize like, oh, that's normal. And here's why, and I talk about shunting, and I talk about, throwing up, and I talk about pooping and peeing on yourself, and all the reasons why are all connected to survival. And so when we do that, everything starts to make sense now. The biggest compliment I get from my brief is everything makes sense now. It all makes sense. And so it's important that first responders have that knowledge. And, that's what I put in my first book, chapter 2 is educate, educate, educate. And I think that's a really important thing to do, because if you don't, then people wonder, they tend to think, oh, I'm so weak, or I can't handle it, or, that kind of stuff. So that's what we do. We educate, normalize.
Doc, suicide is in law enforcement and military and really all first responders becoming more prevalent, and it's more talked about. From a therapy standpoint, I know getting in first and early intervention is critical, but can you talk about something else, that indicators that we could look for? Because we've lost a lot of officers to suicide.
I think that where we start is we start at the beginning. We start with our recruits. We reach out to the people we care about that are already on the force, and we have those discussions. Everybody puts those memes about how I'd rather listen to your story than attend your funeral, but that really needs to be put into action. Right. And so I think what we do is we start to really change the culture so that we know that a lot of first responders contemplate suicide. And unfortunately, a lot of them it's complete suicide. And so where we start is with the culture that it really truly is okay to reach out. And what has to happen is the people who are feeling that desperation have to get good help, but have to be allowed to come back to work. To me, I think the biggest prohibitor of people reaching out is they're afraid they're going to lose their job. And so they feel like, well, by the time they're so depressed and their brain is telling them to kill themselves, they feel like it's just a better option to just kill myself because my family and everybody else will be much better off without me. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So I think departments have to put their money where their mouth is and really allow officers to receive help, to heal, to recover, and come back successfully. And I think when that happens, you're going to have a lot more people who are going to be a lot more honest about where their mindset is at.
Yeah, Doc, we were just looking at the numbers on Blue Help for this year. It's at 106. I mean, that's pretty astronomical, not compared to the years previous, but we're really not even through this entire year with a few more months out with the holiday season coming up. I think you touched on a lot, and I'm really glad Joe asked that question about the moral injury. I think that's something that all of us suffer, no matter where you're at, whether you're a U.S. veteran or a first responder. And I think a lot of people get tied up and get wrapped up in, especially in our profession. I've seen it in the past where therefore, with good reason, there's a lot of help for our U.S. veterans, for sure. I've had the privilege of speaking to many of them, and when they go to compare, how they are hurt, if you ever try to compare yourself to them, most of them will be the first to say, no, you have it just as bad as I. And it's a very hard thing to accept, and it's not a comparison, a tit for tat, or let's see who's got the worst. But I think as first responders, we all forget that that we do suffer. We just don't necessarily see it. You may not be in a war zone or have fought your way out of a crisis, but at some point in time throughout your career, you've done that on a daily basis. And I think most people forget the second you walk out your door, our bodies go into the red. Most people should be in their defensive mode the second they walk outside their door, especially if you have a take-home vehicle. And then you come home to your house still in the red, and you go to decompress, and then now you're going to add in some family problems, whether it be divorce, child custody, a death, just no matter what it is, or just your own personal grief. And now deal with the thought of suicide. And I think I'm very grateful that you mentioned all of that, and including the peer support. I think the other piece of the peer support is a lot of departments don't want to touch it because they feel like there's some type of liability or some type of legal issue with it. They don't realize that there is training from a guided therapist such as yourself, a doctor with high education and very great experience in doing such, and a lot of peer support programs fall short. We're trying to kind of create or mock something up with the Assist the Officer Foundation in order to help support, and that's all that this foundation is for. But we'll have to steer into that as is, but I think most departments just don't want to talk about it. The wellness piece, being able to talk, and just like you mentioned too, people want to go to a departmental psychiatrist. They're extremely fearful that no matter what they say is going to be drawn back upon them. They would rather go seek outside source and help. But yeah, I think that's great that you're out there doing what you do, and we appreciate it very much so. You and all the others like you.
Thank you. What I always tell first responders is that you are supposed to be impacted because you're not a sociopath. The first thing that my patients say when they start to, you're not a sociopath. And the first thing my patients do when they start to cry is they apologize. I'm sorry is the first words that come out of their mouth. And I'm like, don't ever apologize for being a human being. And then I tag on, by the way, congratulations, you're not a sociopath. And then they start laughing. So they're laughing and crying at the same time, which is awesome, right? The other thing is, our first responders come in and they'll say, Tania, I didn't have to storm through Fallujah. I didn't have to go to combat. And I'll tell you what you said, they say, well, I only had to do it for a year. These guys have to do it for 25. And so it's very interesting to see, because everybody kind of comes in with, their own kind of reference point. And our veterans are like, hats off to these guys that have to do this for 25 years because they understand what you're going through. It's just yours is so much more prolonged. And so it's a really cool way to kind of bring people's walls down when they say, well, I didn't have it as bad as. I always tell them what the other group says about their group. So that's a really good way to kind of bridge that gap.
Doc, we're a bunch of amateurs here doing this podcast for the Assist the Officer Foundation. Will EMDR cure my stuttering? Can that help me get through this? That's the only reason that's why I want to go through it.
So I don't know if there's an EMDR protocol for stuttering, but you keep working on it, right?
It's a daily struggle, trust me, and the listeners know that by hearing me. Doc, to wrap this up, I want to ask you what's next for Dr. Glenn. What do you have on the horizon that you're going to continue to do to help us keep us safe and keep our mental health as best as it can be to serve and protect?
So, I'm so excited where we're heading. What a great question. Thank you for asking. So at the practice, like I said, we have a new documentary coming out. That's the sort of the short-term goal. The long-term goal is I have really created a team that will be able to take this practice from me when I retire if I die suddenly, unexpectedly, one of my team members is in my will to take over the practice. So this continues. But in the past year and a half, I have really started to cultivate those therapists to start to travel and do the level of intensity work that I do. And they really are, we have, instead of just seeing patients kind of all day, every day, I've started to ask them to step up and do more stuff, to do, peer support training, to travel, to respond to crises, to go out at 2 a.m. to the officer who is involved in the shooting, and to have those experiences, because my goal is to leave my practice to a team of very, very competent people who I'll basically hand the practice over to. So that's kind of where we are now, is just training the group to continue on and kind of being a force multiplier now, because I've got, several of them. And so we're headed that direction. We're going to continue to really, really hit the preventative aspect of trauma response versus the, let's wait around to see if something goes wrong with your life and your brain and your heart and your mind. Let's prevent it. So I think pushing the prevention, that's probably going to be one of my next books, is the preventative aspects. And I'm also considering doing a book with a combat veterans. That will be a book for veterans. So lots of good stuff on the horizon. I'll probably be 85 when I retire. So.
Hey, if you're continually helping people, that's good. That's what you're about, right?
Yeah, I just love it. I do love it.
Doc, that's good to hear that you're handing off that torch, because as we push forward in the future here, there's going to be more and more people that are going to need that help, and there's only one of you, and so there's a few other doctors I know I wish we could clone, but we can't clone them quick enough, right? So it's awesome to hear that you're going down that road.
Yeah, thank you.
Doc, how do officers make an appointment to get that information out there?
Yeah, so you just go to my website, which is www.tania.Glenn with 2 N's, so TaniaGlenn.com. And on the contact tab, there's our email and our office phone number. And so you could call or you can send an email. You are going to hear back really quickly within the day. If you call, if you call at 7 o'clock at night, it'll be the next morning. But we will get back to you quickly, and we'll get you in as quickly as we can. So it's just super simple.
Doc, I think it's a perfect way to wrap it up. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule and meeting with us. And I look forward to working with you and hearing from you in the future. And I'm looking forward to your next book and also your documentary out in December. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. It was an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey brother, hey sister, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter how far the sun and the moon, I'll never give up on you. Down when you're lonely, I'll pull you up. Life leaves you heavy when the going gets tough. I'll be your shoulder, together we'll run. Up from the bottom, yeah, we'll rise above. Hey brother, hey sister, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter mister, I'll never give up on you. Hey Mrs., hey mister, I'll see this all the way through. No matter how far, for the gold and the blue, I will never give up on you.